Hello, welcome to The Charge. This week coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. I'm having a chat with Councillor Jonathan Sri, a really fascinating guy. He does a lot of campaigns and advocating for sort of better use of space for community purposes in Brisbane. So bringing bus lanes, more bus lanes and bike lanes, things like that. And we're talking about the future of energy, electric cars. If you do like it, click like and enjoy.
I hope, or my vision is that we can transition pretty quickly to 100% renewable energy generation. The research has been done, the work's out there. Any number of independent organisations have demonstrated quite clearly that it's possible. The problem really seems to be one of political will. So probably the more interesting question is, what kind of energy network are we looking at? Do we imagine giant solar power plants out in the desert feeding the cities, or are we looking more like a distributed network where people are generating solar energy and other forms of renewable energy on their own properties and either feeding that back into the grid or feeding that locally into community-owned power networks? So there's been a lot of interesting work around community-owned solar power plants that aren't this sort of massive for-profit enterprise, but local co-ops where you buy buy enough panels for a large roof space and then collectively generate energy for yourselves. And so I think that's kind of the more interesting question. It's not, will we shift to renewables? We will eventually, and we definitely need to. The question is, will our network still be heavily controlled by a few big companies, or will it be controlled by ordinary users?
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, there's especially in England, there's a lot of crowd-funded community groups.
Yeah.
And they've raised £1 million, and they've installed wind turbines or even solar parks, because that does work in England as well. Solar is like 80% efficient in England.
Yeah, right.
And we're in Brisbane, and actually solar panels are less efficient here than they are in Victoria. It's just too hot.
Yeah,
so
right.
they lose a lot of efficiency, but they're still very useful, of course.
Yeah.
Do you think there are any sort of benefits that people might not immediately think of if Australia had more renewables? So if it was, say, 25% renewable, what are some benefits that people might get without realising it?
Energy would be cheaper. Like, I think that is the biggest myth that prevails in Australian society, is this idea that fossil fuel, burning coal, etc., ends up being cheaper than renewable energy. But when you add in all the externalities, when you look at all the massive subsidies that the coal industry receives, actually it's not cheaper or more efficient. It's just heavily subsidised in terms of the road infrastructure that we build to these mining projects, in terms of the tax concessions and royalty discounts. We give the resources industry so much, we give the fossil fuel industry so much in terms of tax concessions and discounts, and they still are struggling to be financially competitive. So I think that needs to be one of the messages that comes to the fore more clearly, is that renewable energy is actually cheaper if you take the profiteering out of the sector, if you take out the middlemen from the electricity retailing industry. Another big benefit, I think, which particularly around vehicle transport, is obviously emissions and air pollution. And so, like, switching to electric vehicles and switching away from fossil fuels isn't just about stopping climate change. It's also just about having a cleaner local environment where the air is purer and people don't have as many respiratory issues, and people who live along main roads don't have like a thick layer of dust on all their windows. Like, those sorts of smaller amenity issues don't get talked about enough. And probably as well as that, like, I could go on all day about the negative environmental impacts of coal mining, the loss of farmland, the degradation of groundwater. The list goes on and on and on. So shifting to renewables isn't just about, hey, we're doing a good thing to stop climate change. It's about more efficiently using resources, cheaper electricity and better prices for consumers, better environmental outcomes both locally and globally. And in some senses, democratizing our whole economic and energy system, because we have such a centralized grid where most of the power is within the hands of a few big energy retailers. Consumers don't have much choice, and they don't have so they have these really high costs that then cripple them in other ways, and because their cost of living is so high, they have less time for engaging with community movements and political engagement, and like getting to know your neighbours. All those little things that come from having a high cost of living flow from, in part, a shitty energy system and a crappy transport system.
So in September, the government announced that they would offer a discount on interest rates for people who want to buy an electric vehicle, and they would knock off 0.5% off of the interest. That's not enough, is it? That's not an incentive for people to buy electric cars. They also give you in Australia $100 off of registration annually, which is nothing. When you consider in Norway, they don't charge any tax to import an electric vehicle, but they charge 100% on any fossil fuel burning car. In other developed countries that are similar, Britain or Norway or America, they let you use bus lanes, they let you park cars for free, they don't charge any registration. You can use ferries for cheaper in Norway, for example. Right. So in Norway, 42% of car sales in August this year were electric cars. New car sales, 42%. In England, it was 2.1%. Here, it was 0.01%.
It's a joke, isn't it?
Which is that's scary. That's not even 0.5% or 1%. And that's not good. It's 0.01%. That's terrible.
And I think all those incentives show, that example shows that incentives do make a difference, and those tax incentives, if we had them here, would probably help to shift a large number of consumers. But we also have to think about it from a social justice and equity perspective, and one possible future is that we end up in a world where the very wealthy can afford really efficient electric cars, and the poor are taxed more heavily because their cars are high fossil fuel emitting and also have higher running costs with petrol, etc. And so maybe one of the questions we need to be asking ourselves, and this is one of the trickier ones that I don't think many people in Australia spend much time thinking about, is our vision of the future of transport in Brisbane, is it that everyone owns and drives an electric car, or is it that we have cheap or even free, universal, accessible public transport? And probably we have to talk more about electric buses and how we can make public transport cheaper and easier to use, rather than just focusing all our energy on how can we make it easier for the upper middle class to buy electric cars. We got to do a bit of both, obviously, but I don't think it's enough to say that, we'll reduce this tax and we'll have this incentive so that more people can buy electric cars, when the poorest people in our society could never dream of buying a new car anyway. So it's and it's obviously also worth thinking about the fact that new cars, whether they're petrol or electric, still have a high resource burden, and some of the components in new electric cars are quite rare metals that have problems with the supply chains and the ethics of the mining companies overseas, etc. So holding electric cars up as a solution is probably not the right approach. They're one piece of a complex puzzle, but I think public transport and walkable neighbourhoods are probably a bigger focus, or need to be a bigger focus.
Yeah, I think people need to realise that no car is green. You can't have a green car. And so I don't think people buy Teslas or Nissan Leafs and sort of advocate that they're green people. And I think the biggest three things that you have for creating your carbon footprint is how you power your house, how you drive to work, or how do you get to work, and what food you eat. And so 51% of your carbon footprint comes from what food you eat.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of vegans are green people.
Yeah, I've heard that stat before. Yeah, and again, it's the thing with this, because there's all this conflicting data about how much, what volume of resources is consumed in manufacturing a new car versus retrofitting an older car, for example. And there's obviously a lot more profit to be made from selling new electric cars. But is there an argument that we should instead be focusing more resources and more of our energy on retrofitting older vehicles and making them more sustainable, because the net impact on non-renewable resources is actually better if we just don't use all that metal and all those electrical components to build a whole new vehicle. Yeah, it's tricky stuff.
Yeah, it's tricky stuff. So how can the average people in society just sort of make things change? Who can we complain to or speak to? What can we do?
It depends a lot on the issue, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the best avenues and levers for political change. When there are big corporate interests that have a sort of a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, expecting that your MPs are going to respond to signatures and petitions and letter writing campaigns is a bit naive, because the influence of the corporate sector is so much stronger than the influence of voters, except perhaps in a few marginal seats. So if you're in a marginal seat where a poly's really nervous about losing their seat, petitions and letter writing campaigns and public protests can sometimes make a bit of a difference. But on any issue where the corporate sector doesn't want things to change, they'll go out of their way to heavily lobby councillors. But with something like the transport networks, and particularly bike lanes, there aren't huge vested corporate interests stacked against shifting to a more sustainable transport network. The problem there is really a lack of political imagination. And in that context, I think more residents contacting their local councillors, more residents signing petitions, more residents turning up to protests in favour of bike lanes or in favour of cheaper public transport actually will make a difference. So it depends very much on the issue. So something like shifting to renewable energy, challenging the coal lobby through petitions and letter writing campaigns, waste of time. Our best strategy in that context is to lock onto coal trucks and blockade coal mines, etc. But for something like getting more bike lanes in the inner city, a few meetings with MPs will actually and councillors will actually go a long way to shifting the political conversation.